Well, there's no question, I think, that it was a major war crime, the only one, as far as I know, committed by a Western power during the war, any major war crime. And had it been committed by enemy troops, and had they been brought, the officers concerned, been brought to trial after the war, they would certainly have been condemned and suffered very severe punishment, probably a death sentence in some cases.
Mr. Tolstoy, for allowing me to interview you. You are the author of several books, including Minister and the Massacres, which was recently published in, I believe, 1986.
Yes.
Your book, Minister and the Massacres, deals with the repatriation of Cossacks, White Russians, Serbians, Slovenes, and Croatians. You go on further to analyze the motives of the forced repatriations, as well as document the Anglo-American policy, the British foreign policy, the American State Department policy, the Joint Chiefs of Staff policy, and then you go on to document the orders of Field Marshal Alexander, General Robertson, General McCreary, General Keatley, and Toby Lowe. Toby Lowe is now known as Lord Aldington.
Yes.
This is highly complex material, and because there are so many names involved, so many levels of authority, so many overlapping dates, can we first establish the hierarchy both in the military and on the political level?
Yes. The high command in the Mediterranean was Anglo-American. The Supreme Allied Commander was English, Field Marshal Alexander. I think it's because the Supreme Allied Commander in chief was an American, Eisenhower, of course. It so happened, and that was pure chance, that the troops who occupied, liberated Austria were British, and it remained under British command. So no United States soldiers were directly involved in any of these events. Nevertheless, there was the combined command, and of course Field Marshal Alexander also had to reflect Anglo-American foreign policy as laid down.
And the Anglo-American policy was laid down by who?
It came to him through the combined chiefs of staff in Washington, who relayed what their government policy as communicated to them and set out by them. Though he was in direct communication also with the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Now, on top of that, he had two political advisors, one British and one American. The British was Harold Macmillan, who was the British minister resident there, and the American was Alexander Kirk. And their job was, they didn't actually, as far as I know, have the power to give any orders to Field Marshal Alexander of any sort at all, but they were there to convey to him the political views of their governments and to relay in turn back to their governments Field Marshal Alexander's, well, the political setup, also any of Field Marshal Alexander's concerns that might affect the political issues.
Now, between Field Marshal Alexander, the American State Department, the British Foreign Office, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who had the highest authority as far as the American side and the British side to set policy?
Well, in general, of course, it was the governments, the two combined governments, which had to decide on a unified policy, because it was a unified command, and who would then issue, through the combined chiefs of staff, their directives. Now, if we move to this specific issue, the handovers or proposed handovers of and I'll use this, if you'll excuse me, a phrase throughout, citizens of Yugoslavia, so as to avoid continually saying Croatians, Serbs, Slovenes, Montenegrins, you know. But I don't mean by that any political implication at all.
Maybe to be clear, just for...
Is this for a Croatian audience? I'll say
This is basically for a Croatian audience.
But on the other hand, it does involve the others.
It does, and maybe the term that they used at the time was anti-Yugoslav, or else Yugoslav dissident.
But that's the British
soldiers.
term. It's in a way convenient to say Yugoslav citizens, because if they didn't wish to, they still weren't they, at that time?
Many of them were, many of them were not. It depends on when they were born. I mean,
well,
down to technicalities.
So in case I get tripped up, I know from my Croatian friends, I understand and appreciate they've reason to be sensitive about this issue. I make it clear at the beginning that if I talk about Yugoslavia or Yugoslav citizens or people from Yugoslavia, I do not mean have any political connotations in that. I simply mean people from that geographical area, which was at that time called Yugoslavia.
Right.
And of course, in the referring to documents and so forth, they use this phrase, Yugoslavs. So I shall have to use it if I'm quoting them or paraphrasing them.
Right. As far as the repatriations are concerned, I think they use the term anti-Yugoslavs.
They use the term dissident Yugoslavs. They use different terms, actually.
Right.
Dissident Yugoslavs, Yugoslavs serving in the German forces, just Yugoslavs. Maybe, I can't remember that offhand, anti-partisan. So I think one has to have one term which is convenient one.
Okay, yeah, right, as long as I think
that's all it is.
Have an understanding.
Exactly.
Because I think the situation could be similar if we were talking about Soviet Union.
Exactly.
We wouldn't want to blend the Ukrainians.
It's a little bit easier because when I talk about Soviet citizens, as distinct from White Russians or as distinct from Ukrainians and Balts and so forth, I think the Soviet Union means somebody from the Soviet Union, whether he likes it or not, which is probably not.
Mm-hmm. There are certain areas, though, that would specifically apply to only Croatia.
Oh, exactly.
So at those
no, then I'll make it clear, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Now, the Allied policy with regard to citizens of Yugoslavia, which naturally included Croatians.
Before we go on, can we just further lay down the authority, the hierarchy of the
oh, yes.
the command? Because I think it's so complex and there are so many people involved, it's important that
yes.
we talk
Well, if we start at the top, you have the British and American governments who, wherever possible and practically invariably, adopted a unified policy. They had to, of course, not only because they were close allies, but because the military commands were inextricably mixed up in Europe. They then issue commands. Now, they could come directly through their political advisors. In the case of Field Marshal Alexander, whose headquarters was at the Palace of Caserta outside Naples, he could receive direct instructions from Prime Minister Churchill, with whom he was in immediate communication. But generally speaking, major policy issues were set out, decided upon by the Allied governments, by the State Department and the Foreign Office, communicated to the combined chiefs of staff, who would then try and thrash it out into an acceptable directive, and this would then be passed down to Field Marshal Alexander. And similarly, he, of course, would make known his views.
Okay, so most of the orders coming from Alexander then would be labeled as Allied Forces Headquarters Commands, something like along those lines?
All from him, yes. He was the Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean, abbreviated to SACMED, and his headquarters was known as Allied Force Headquarters. And certainly everything that came down to the level at which these things were decided in Austria would have come from Allied Force Headquarters, and nobody else had power to intervene. Of course, the soldiers don't like people intervening from outside.
Mm-hmm. And then the next level down...
Next level was 15th Army Group, commanded by the American General Mark Clark. To some extent, 15th Army Group didn't sort of existed as an headquarters, but there wasn't actually an army. I mean, but the orders passed through Clark. Mm-hmm. From him, and in this case of what we're talking about, that really didn't play a very big part. I doubt if Mark Clark knew anything about these issues.
Most of it went through the 8th Army.
Then went on to British 8th Army, which included responsibility for occupied Austria, which was administered by the British 5th Corps, which was part of 8th Army.
And who was the general in charge of the British 8th Army?
That was General Richard McCreery, who was a very good tank general who'd fought in the desert and personal friend of Field Marshal Alexander.
And his administrative assistant is Robertson?
And that was back at Allied Force Headquarters. The chief administrative officer was General Robertson, who, it's difficult always to distinguish, but on operational issues, Alexander would send a directive from himself. If it was administrative, it would probably go out through General Robertson. And one, as we know, very significant order did come from General Robertson in this case.
And then the next level down...
Then to return to, from below 8th Army was the British 5th Corps with its headquarters at Klagenfurt in Carinthia, commanded by General Richard Keighley.
Okay, and what was General Keighley's assistant's name?
His chief of staff for operations was called Toby Lowe, who was responsible for all operational administration and issuing of orders, more or less a chief of staff, certainly in the British Army. There's nothing that his commanding officer does that he wouldn't know about, and indeed he might do things on occasion which he wouldn't bother to inform, or of which his superior commander might only be partially informed. The superior commander is out and about in the field, making snap judgments and orders, whilst it's the chief of staff's duty to put all this into proper form and see that it's effectively implemented.
And then from the 5th Corps, they would in turn send orders down to the individual...
Down to the divisional commanders, and so down to the brigade commanders, and finally to the battalion commanders.
Okay. Okay, then if we could just go back then to where you wanted to lay out and establish the Anglo-American policy concerning repatriations of these various ethnic groups, including Croatians, to the Yugoslavs. What was the policy as of May 2nd, 1945?
The policy which was handed down on that date to the independently to the two political advisors whom I mentioned, was that, I'm paraphrasing, but that no citizen of Yugoslavia shall be handed, or no Yugoslav shall be handed back against his will. And on the 29th of April, Churchill had already notified the Foreign Office that this should be the policy, that they should be interned and their fate decided at some future date. This was in accordance with general traditions of granting asylum to political refugees, and also a strong consciousness of the fact that Yugoslavia had been racked with civil war, and that the Allies had backed, in particular, backed Mihailovic among the Chetniks at an earlier date, and quite clearly they were very, very well aware that to hand over Chetniks would be handing them over to their deaths. And this would be inexcusable. But even on the question of Ustashi, who had fought on the other side, it was nevertheless unwavering policy of both the British and Americans that they should not be handed over. It was briefly considered by some Foreign Office officials that the Ustashi were not deserving of sympathy and should be handed over. But the same official who suggested this said that no doubt the Americans will not agree. And the Americans did not agree, and therefore this policy was never considered. Are you aware that at the time that there was a clear distinction between the Ustashi and the Domobrans in the Croatian armed forces, and that the British Army, at least many officers in the British Army, did recognize that there was a difference between Domobran and Ustashi? I'm certainly aware that there was such a distinction as far as the factual reality goes. I think when it comes to how far given British officers or political figures were aware of these realities, then I think really it's quite difficult ground to establish, and it's very different, varying from individual to individual. I would say that on the ground there was a very considerable degree of confusion or ignorance about this. I wouldn't have thought, quite for instance, that I would doubt, they might be wrong, whether Winston Churchill would have known that such a difference existed. I think they just, generally there was a tendency, and we have to remember this is in the last week of the war or the first week after, and then the many pressing considerations, that people were pretty ignorant. I would think many people probably thought that Croatians as a whole had helped the enemy and were not so deserving of sympathy, the British and American people, I mean, as, say, Serbs or Slovenes. But this didn't, in effect, whether they thought that or not, and some did and some didn't actually affect the judgment, the decisions, because the decision in the end was never that any Croatian at all. So really, I agree it's a valid historical issue. It didn't affect this decision, at least not as I see it.
Okay. Wasn't it true that Harold Macmillan was first notified by Harold Stevenson, who was then ambassador to Yugoslavia, that all anti-partisan troops should be, number one, disbanded, number two, placed in refugee camps, and number three, that surrendering them to Tito would have violated the general policy of asylum at the time?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. And Macmillan then passed on that notification, either on the 2nd or 3rd of May, to Field Marshal Alexander. And it then became official policy in the field. This decision was passed down, and on or about the 4th of May, I think only one day later, it so happened that the British 8th Army accepted the surrender of 11,000 or 12,000 Serbian Chetniks, who had managed to fight their way across the lines, across the Isonzo, and there they surrendered to McCreary's 8th Army, and their surrender was accepted, and indeed they were never handed back, and in accordance with this policy. And this policy was never officially rescinded, certainly not by the Allied governments. No new directive came down, ever.
As you said, Prime Minister Churchill agreed with Stevenson's recommendation to
Rafe Stevenson, wasn't it, I think? Not Harold.
It was not Harold Stevenson?
Yeah, I think it's Rafe Stevenson, yes.
And then later on May 2nd, the U.S. State Department agreed with the British policy and with Alexander Kirk's recommendation to hold anti-Tito partisan forces in refugee camps and not to surrender them to Tito. So there was, at least at that period of time, May 2nd, May 3rd, there was the total agreement by Churchill, by the U.S. State Department, by U.S. Representative Kirk in Allied Forces headquarters, as well as the Foreign Office and the ambassador to Yugoslavia at the time. They were all in agreement that people should not be repatriated back, that they should be held.
Yes, exactly. And even Macmillan, who, as we know later, adopted a different policy, even he simply passed on this directive without apparently questioning it or trying to modify it or stop it. And it was accepted, as I say, all the way down in the field, and the sizable number did surrender, and their surrender was accepted. This is before British forces entered Austria. The British general, the divisional commander, General Horatius Murray, commanding the 6th Armoured Division, who actually accepted the surrender of these Chetniks, he said that they stressed that if they're handed over, they'll all be slaughtered, and I think he said words to the effect he had no reason to doubt that they were honest in this belief, and he moreover could not believe that any British government would wish to hand these people over against their will. So he too, at that level, was quite clearly strongly against handing over such people. This was the position right up to the arrival of British troops in Austria.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it seems that the confusion really started to happen somewhere around May 8th.
I think I would put it later. I would put it, quite frankly, I think there was a complete turnabout on May the 13th. Because there was, as far as I know, there was no inkling of any change in the policy before May the 13th.
And it was May the 13th that Macmillan flew to Klagenfurt to confer with General Keighley of the 5th Corps.
Yes.
Do you know what they discussed, or do you have an idea?
Well, one would dearly love to know more. General Keighley died by coincidence the same day that I originally wrote to him in about 1974 asking to interview him. But I didn't think I would have got anywhere anyway, because I do know that Lord Bethell, writing before me, wrote, and Keighley refused to see him, so I didn't think we'd have got anything. Lord Aldington, as he now is, the Chief of Staff, under any normal circumstances, a Chief of Staff would undoubtedly have been present at such a meeting, but Lord Aldington claims that he wasn't present, and as there are no minutes of the meeting, there's no telling one way or the other. And anyhow, he says that we're not going to get anything out of him. Macmillan is dead. Now, Macmillan's diary, the diary does give an account of what happened. What Macmillan says is, after discussing his recommendation that the Cossacks should be handed over, he then goes, and it's very interesting to read the wording, into the question of people and who were fleeing across the Yugoslav frontier. And he quite clearly, this was discussed in some detail, because Macmillan goes into them, he lists them, I forget what he says, but I think he says Ustashi, Serbs, Slovenes, some of them women and children, and then he goes on and says who are being accused now of being fascists simply because they're Catholic or anti-partisan, which is a sort of fashion, he says, I see creeping in. Now that's all he says. He doesn't say that he made any recommendation or that their fate was considered one way or the other. But the strong impression is that he felt very sympathetic to their plight and hoped that nothing unpleasant would happen to them.
He seemed to understand then that the term fascist was applied to all these different anti-Tito.
He didn't share that ignorance which was to be found in many quarters at that time. He was strongly sympathetic, even, as he says himself, to the Ustashi. And though he might now say, or might before he died, have said, well, one shouldn't feel any sympathy for them, that's not what he felt at the time, or what he claimed he felt at the time. One has to remember that his diary was compiled in the form of letters sent to his wife and was intended for future publication, so that everything in that diary was carefully considered for future publication. And I think I say that advisedly because, in fact, the evidence is absolutely clear that Macmillan recommended, as we know from General McCreary's report of the following day, and also from a message from Alexander Kirk to the State Department of the 15th of May, and both reported that Macmillan had urged or recommended the handover of, quote, the Yugoslavs. So that therefore I think it's impossible to interpret Macmillan's crocodile tears about these people as being anything but a smokescreen intended in case one day these people, having been handed over, that they were indeed, as he expected, harshly treated, and the news of this got out and he might be thought accountable, seeing he'd been there.
General Robertson of the Allied Forces headquarters sent a telegram to the 8th Army authorizing General McCreary to hand over 20,000 Cossacks as well as anti-Yugoslav troops, except for Chetniks, as you said. Do you believe that he got the idea that this was acceptable through some sort of discussions with Macmillan?
Yes, it seems quite clear, and that would of course be a matter important to establish, but it seems quite clear that Macmillan himself did not inform Alexander of any of these, say, important issues about the Cossacks and, quote, Yugoslavs. And though he dined with Alexander the very evening he got back and spent the whole evening with him and never mentioned this. That's quite clear from other orders which were passed between different commanders later. But Robertson, the account by Alexander Kirk of what Robertson then subsequently told Kirk, makes it absolutely clear that it was Macmillan who contacted Robertson, and Robertson didn't simply get a message from Alexander. Because Robertson refers to things which nor, for instance, a possibility which one might consider is that McCreary sent a report to Robertson and Robertson responded without Macmillan coming into it. It's quite clear because Robertson's order refers to things which are not in McCreary's report, which only Macmillan could have known, and which there's no other record of reaching Robertson. So what seems the explanation as I see it, without being able to go into every detail here, the explanation is that Macmillan was very well aware that Alexander would never authorize, would never violate Allied policy, nor would he contemplate doing something so dishonorable as handing over these people who had formally surrendered in this way. We'll come on to, of course, the other matter of the main body of Croatians later.
Just one question still about this telegram from General Robertson. Wasn't it in this telegram that he also said that he can't worry about who will be shot when the repatriations begin?
Yes. When Alexander Kirk said this was wrong, because Robertson went to ask his advice, by implication, as it seems to me, having got the recommendation from Macmillan, Robertson thought, well, I better see what the Americans say. And he then went, as we know from Kirk's telegram, to see Kirk. Kirk, unexpectedly, said, no, this is wrong and against my government's policy, and I shall have to apply for a ruling on this. Robertson didn't wait, and he said he wouldn't wait. And as you say, he said, it's not our concern whether some of these people are shot.
So in effect, Robertson's orders was a direct violation of Anglo-American policy at the time.
Yes, it was. Well, he probably thought it wasn't a violation of British policy because Macmillan, he would have no reason to know that Macmillan wasn't, didn't have authority for what he said. Macmillan, after all, was in touch with the Prime Minister. I think, I wouldn't like to say, just looking at Robertson for a moment, and he's dead, and nobody ever interviewed him, so we'll never know how much Robertson knew. But I think a charitable explanation would say that there is no evidence that Robertson knew what was going on, and given the extent of the deceit which Macmillan practiced on everyone else around him, it seems to me perfectly possible that Robertson was deceived likewise.
If we could just discuss for a minute...
one very, very important point with Robertson is that by this stage, only 24 hours had elapsed. When Macmillan saw Robertson the next day on the 14th, the entire picture had changed overnight, with the arrival of what was reputed to be hundreds of thousands of Croatians fleeing from Tito, both troops and civilians. This was not known to Macmillan. He only knew about the much smaller numbers, 35 or 40 or 50,000, who'd actually already surrendered. And he left before the news had come in of this vastly bigger eruption into the British area. And so that when Macmillan returned, he wasn't talking about them. Then came the news by what was, for Macmillan, a very lucky coincidence. And now Robertson must have been considering them and did not know the true facts. posts, which were in fact that it was a relatively small, manageable number. So you see, again, I think that Robertson may well have been ignorant.
I think we discussed this earlier, but while Macmillan might not have known that these 200,000 or 300,000 Croatians were headed across the border, across the river Drava into Austria, there's, I think, substantial evidence to show that he probably knew at least that they were headed in that direction, and that there may be a possibility that their plans or their intentions were to cross over to Austria.
Well, in any case, well, it's certainly true that he would, I'm sure he would have known that they were approaching, or at least that they were in the offing. I don't know that it's clear that on the 13th he would have anticipated their falling into British hands, or attempting to, because every indication that the British military authorities presumed that Tito would stop them getting across the Drava, and it came as a big surprise on the afternoon of the 13th when their advance guards arrived, as we know, before Bleiburg and requested a surrender to the British. That was after Macmillan's departure, but by the early hours of the 14th, before he saw Robertson, by then Macmillan did know, because 5 Corps this had already happened, and Macmillan had been notified.
So Macmillan had sent a telegram on May 14th to General Keighley of the 5th Corps that he should surrender all Yugoslav nationals to Tito.
General Robertson did. I thought you said Macmillan.
Didn't Macmillan send a telegram also on...
No. What Macmillan did, Macmillan was very clever. He never came out in writing anywhere, as far as I know. He, on the 13th, said, I mean, this is rather going ahead, but I think can be well substantiated from all the evidence, but Macmillan gave a private, secret directive to Keighley. Both of them were very well aware that this was something which would not be acceptable to higher command. And so Macmillan not only said, look, hand these people back, but said, don't alert your superiors to what's going on, at least certainly not to many of the major implications. And it was handled in that way secretly, and it's significant that in the early hours of the morning, just after midnight that evening, Brigadier Lowe sent a situation report to 8th Army about everything that was happening that day. But he also sent just that part which dealt with the Cossacks and, quote, Yugoslavs, an extract. He sent that straight to Macmillan, which is very unusual because there's no other extract that I know of that was sent in that way straight to Macmillan.
Okay, so that although the order did come from Allied Forces headquarters through Robinson, it's your contention that Macmillan didn't actually know, or didn't actually
by the time Robertson
send the order himself.
No, he didn't send it. It definitely came from Robertson. Right. But Robertson was acting on Macmillan's instructions, and Macmillan knew by then all about the Croatians.
And Robertson sent back just to this order from Allied Forces headquarters to General Keighley. The words were the surrender of personnel of established Yugoslav nationality who were serving in German forces. They should be disarmed and handed over to Yugoslav forces. There was nothing there really explicitly that mentioned the women and children, was there?
Certainly not, and I think it very unlikely that Robertson envisaged women and children being handed over. And in fact, it's quite clear that that order, even though it does violate the policy hitherto followed, which was that nobody from Yugoslavia should be handed back against their will, nevertheless, it's still quite restricted in its terms, and had it been adhered to, we don't know how many, but a much smaller number would have been handed over than actually were. And it's very important to see the phraseology, I think, because first of all, it restricts it to those who were definitely serving in the German forces. Now, I suspect that if one were very literal about it, that hardly any would be found to have been serving actually in the German forces. And as we all know, and as people knew then, the situation was extremely confused. And I mean, even if one extended it to collaboration with the enemy, which is a very different matter in fact, what was collaboration in the context of wartime Yugoslavia? I mean, Tito collaborated, or at least he certainly conducted negotiations with the Germans.
Collaboration tends to imply unofficial armies, guerrilla forces, or individuals collaborating.
But collaboration could mean almost anything, couldn't it? It could mean agreeing not to attack each other in order to attack a third party more conveniently. It could mean receiving arms or uniforms, but then using them independently. Or it could extend right across to people who actually were commanded by German officers and doing what the Germans said. So quite clearly, but supposing the screening under these very difficult conditions had been even rough and ready. I think the most significant point is that it was contemplated that screening would take place. And this is precisely what did not happen. And the orders from the outset were interpreted by General Keighley, and in particular by his chief of staff, to whom he deputed the management of all these operations, Brigadier Lowe, who chose to interpret it that all people from Yugoslavia, regardless of whether they'd served in the German forces and regardless of their status as civilians, were to be handed back. And that has to be explained why he altered his own orders to that extraordinary extent.
Wasn't it on the same day, May 14th, that Toby Lowe, later known as Lord Aldington, sent a telegram to 8th Army headquarters, and he asked, what do we do about anti-partisan forces? And then apparently General Keighley added a note of his own suggesting that Croats be made Tito's show.
General McCreary added that note, higher up the line. You see, it's very extraordinarily interesting again. This report, which is the first report to come up from 5th Corps, and which contains all the information that was available to anyone above from 8th Army upwards. First of all, it's quite extraordinary. It conceals the fact that some, I forget how many, 40 or 50,000 people from refugees from Yugoslavia, including Croats, had already surrendered and had their surrender accepted. It conceals that, and they're the people that Macmillan talked about when he was there, because they were the only ones he knew about. Mm-hmm. But instead of that, it refers to the 200,000 or 300,000 Croats believed now approaching, and whose surrender we may be obliged to accept, I think it says. So they were quite clearly already taking precautions to be enabled to include all these people who are already surrendered, and to conceal the fact from their superiors.
What's your opinion as to what that means, make the Croats Tito's show? Do you have any idea?
You see, General McCreary went on adding that when he passed up his own summary of the thing on the same day, on the 14th of May, added, suggest Croats become Tito's show. By then, McCreary knew of the advance of this colossal number of Croats. Now, I don't want to defend British policy in this respect, but I think if one explains it, it seems to me there's a gigantic distinction between the very relatively small, manageable numbers who had actually surrendered to the British and this colossal number, which was actually not known how many, because when they talk of 200,000 or 300,000, they very often go on to say that there obviously could be many more coming after them. Mm-hmm. That this number who had not yet surrendered, but who were advancing in huge numbers, which 5 Corps simply administratively couldn't have accepted, there was a panic, and they thought we must stop these people surrendering to us. And this is what McCreary is referring to, not to the handover of anybody who's already surrendered. Then there arose very considerable confusion, because a false report, this was pure accident, nobody's plan, was received at 8th Army that 5 Corps had actually accepted the surrender of the entire Croatian army with all its accompanying civilians, several 100,000. And this report was passed on right up to Allied Force headquarters, causing great concern and alarm. And it was, as far as Allied Force headquarters knew throughout all this, and setting aside Macmillan, all the military knew at Allied Force headquarters was about this very large number of Croatians. They never were informed and did not know at this time of the smaller number who had already surrendered, but who were subsequently handed back.
Okay. On May 14th, 1945, the Yugoslav communists broadcast from Belgrade that the Ustaša, or the Croatian groups, are still putting up resistance, and an operation for their complete annihilation is in progress. Do you feel that it's possible that there was already a deal in the making? When they mention that there's a complete annihilation is in the progress, it seems that already they're aware of some plans that are made for the annihilation of the Croatian army. Do you think that possibly there might have been plans already in the making on May 14th?
Well, I think that it's rather hard to know what to make of that, because first of all, that report envisages Tito as managing to cut off these people before they crossed the Drava, and at this time, of course, there were partisan troops on the Drava. As it happened, the line was broken, but it wasn't broken at the time of that report. And so it was envisaged, and Tito was boasting that he would in fact destroy them himself, but he proved incapable of it. I think annihilation wouldn't necessarily mean the sort of something approaching genocide which actually took place, because if you talk about annihilating an enemy force, I think that's a legitimate expression for simply utterly crushing them and defeating them in battle. So I don't think that would, and it certainly wouldn't necessarily implicate the British in the decision at all, seeing that at that stage they wouldn't envisage being implicated.
I guess the reason I bring it up is I find it interesting that Macmillan visited General Keatley on May 13th in Klagenfurt. On May 14th, the Croatian army was already at the border of the Drava River. And here again on May 14th, Tito makes mention of the fact that there's an operation in progress for the total annihilation, in that possibly it's a coincidence, but
Well, I think that events, of course, were moving extremely fast at this time. One has to recognize this. And that overnight the problem changed from being Tito's problem to one involving the British on a very big scale. And I think this is what McCreary had in mind when he said that he suggested they became Tito's problem. In other words, push them back or stop them getting in. Mm-hmm. And this was misinterpreted up the line as meaning that they'd actually already crossed over. And you see, I think one's got to picture what would the British have actually done? I mean, could they in any way? I mean, now one can say, which would be right, that under terms of international law, maybe if they'd accepted their surrender, which they never did in practice, then they were obliged, whatever the numbers or the difficulties, but in practical terms and practicalities have to come into it. They couldn't have maintained them in Austria, and indeed they must have been worried whether they could stop them. And then they had a further worry, and that was that the Allies were on such bad terms with Tito at this time because of his occupation of Trieste and attempted occupation of southern Carinthia, that already it was the possibility of violence or even war between Yugoslavia and the Anglo-Americans was having to be contemplated. Had there been a vast influx of Croatians still fighting in British-occupied Carinthia, this would have been a frightfully complicated position if war had broken out, and might have enabled Tito, for example, to have his troops placed right in the heart of the British zone. Mm-hmm. I think these are all, I mean, whether people considered these things, I wouldn't like to say, because the thing was flashing past so quickly that it's hard to stop each moment and say what people knew. You can say on certain issues, and others they may have had them in the back of their minds.
It seems to me, though, that once the Croatian army had laid down their arms, and I've spoken with several eyewitnesses, both Croatian and British, who say that their behavior was pretty mild, considering that their numbers were in excess of 200,000 people, that it would be difficult to construe some sort of crisis on just analyzing them from a behavioral point of view.
I don't think the crisis would have been seen enough. Again, one's got to remember that the negotiations which took place between Brigadier Scott and General Herincic took place certainly in the ignorance without Eighth Army playing any part in it whatever, because the Eighth Army there wasn't time to inform them. And I think that even Five Corps was not very fully informed, simply through lack of time, that Scott, as he says himself, more or less off his own bat, browbeat Herincic, who seems to have been very weak in this respect, into accepting the terms laid down by Basta in Bleiburg Castle, and that the thing then was just pushed through in that respect. But I mean, if one were to look at the consideration you've raised, that, as you say, that the Croatians showed no signs of wishing to fight with the British. On the contrary, the one thing they wanted was to surrender and be interned peacefully. But I think the British might well have accepted all that as true. They saw it for themselves. But after all, they had other things. How would they look after such a vast number of people? And what would they do if hostilities broke out with Tito, with this very difficult and fluid situation, with a huge number of people from Yugoslavia, with partisan troops in hot pursuit among them, as we know, who might have increased greatly in number, fighting taking place within the British zone? I think all these were things which would be very difficult to contemplating accepting at that time.
Do you think one option open to Alexander, which he didn't use at the time, but he did at a later time, would be to ask American forces through General Eisenhower to somehow accept some of the responsibility in his part of Europe for holding these people until something could be done with them? In other words, there were other options, other then turn the Croatians back over to the Yugoslav government?
Well, you see, it's not like me to defend British policy, but I think I would a bit in this respect, because at this very time, and we are talking after all about these hectic days, there's only 2 or at most 3 days for the 14th, 15th, 16th of May. During that time, as you say, Alexander did appeal to Eisenhower to take the German prisoners who'd surrendered in Austria, who were there in colossal numbers. I think they talked about 1 million of them. But he said, I will look after the Cossacks, and subsequently when he found out about the much smaller number of Yugoslavs. But that was later. At this stage, he knew nothing about the 50,000 or so distinct people from Yugoslavia who had already surrendered. Now, Eisenhower, first of all, was very chary about what he could take. He said, my own supply lines and resources are very strained. And I think Eisenhower, if one looks at the dispatches at that stage, would have said, I cannot take 250,000 people from you who don't belong in Germany. I think he would have refused it, I'm afraid. And I think Alexander, he couldn't have taken them down into Italy. You see, the crisis came, if one pictures it from the point of view of looking outside the forced repatriation operations, a crisis blew up very, very swiftly, blew up as the New Zealand troops entered Trieste. It then escalated with partisans infiltrating Carinthia, being on very bad terms, Tito getting very aggressive and saying he was going to take over all these places. And then the British and Americans called his bluff, and by about, I would think about by the 19th, Tito agreed to pull his people out of Carinthia, and by about the 22nd or 23rd, all Yugoslav troops had pulled out of Carinthia. So it's during that week that things fluctuated enormously. And I think you could excuse a lot that happened on, say, the 14th, 15th, 16th, when there was real alarm going on. But having said that, you see, they didn't contemplate, Alexander did not contemplate, even at that time, handing over those who had already surrendered, and the Cossacks.
Mm-hmm. Of course, at the time, he believed that the Croatians also had surrendered.
Yes, he was led mistakenly to believe, a genuine error, that they had surrendered, and he then sent the famous dispatch, which is often quoted out of context, as I see it, to Tito, which was passed up via the military mission in Trieste, which then got to you. It was all rather slow, this, considering how... the message passing was slower than the actual events. So by the time it reached Tito, I don't think that Tito... There's no evidence that I know that Tito at that stage knew that the Croatians had not surrendered. Everything was happening. And Tito naturally said, I'd be very glad to have them. But then inquiries were simultaneously going on from 15th Army Group down to 8th Army, and it was very swiftly reported by 5th Corps that in fact they'd not surrendered. And so this order was then ineffective. It never had been effective.
I hate to run this one point.
No, it's very important.
But I think it is important because
yes.
It seems to me that if Alexander did believe that the Croatian army had surrendered to him, then, number one, he was turning over people that had surrendered to the British army, to the British government, and he was taking those people who surrendered, and rather than give asylum, which it would be normally done in the situation, he turned them over. Now, that's one problem, and I think the other problem that develops out of this is the fact that women and children were also repatriated with the Croatian soldiers, which I don't even think Alexander at the time considered.
No, he didn't.
It'd be interesting to find out or to know exactly who decided that all Croatians, men, women, and children, and soldiers should be turned over to Tito. Do you happen to have any idea? Well,
it's quite clear that neither Alexander nor Robertson envisaged civilians being handed over, and Robertson's order, indeed, if it were interpreted as written, there wouldn't have been any women and children handed over. Macmillan clearly knew about the women and children because he talks about them in his diary when he conferred with Keighley. Well, as Lowe took it upon himself on the 17th and on the 19th of May to issue orders which resulted in the handing back and specifically laid down that every single, not only Croatian but Slovene and Serb, should be handed over regardless of age or sex. Quite clearly 5 Corps knew what they were doing. Question is, did they get any orders from anyone above them? Well, they certainly didn't in the military line of command. And indeed they couldn't have done, because they never reported to their superiors that they'd got any women and children, as far as I remember. And so they, but they clearly didn't do it for no reason. They didn't actually, if we set aside for a moment again the 250,000 or more, which was the hugeness of it, which was what made everyone daunted. But if you took the manageable number who'd already surrendered, there was absolutely no problem about looking after them, or very little. I mean, I can explain in a minute why that really wasn't a problem. I think, so if one looks at it in broad terms, it seems to me that when you talk about the tens of thousands who'd surrendered before this, and include the Cossacks, that was a bit of a headache, but not excessive. And indeed, as events showed during the coming week, the Allies had ample resources for looking after these people, and made it clear that they had them, and nobody from Alexander down to McCreary thought there was any problem about it. It's only at 5 Corps they pretended that there was a problem which they didn't report to their superiors, oddly enough. Whereas I think that I agree with you, and it's perfectly true, that Alexander could be held to have contemplated violating international law. I think, I'm not an international lawyer, in offering to hand over troops who had already surrendered to him, to Tito. And to that extent, you could certainly say that he was blameworthy. But there are two considerations, or perhaps more, to be urged against this in his, well, not in his favor, but as compensating considerations. One is that it never happened, because they didn't surrender to the British. So you might say, well, that doesn't destroy his intention, which was bad, but still, it's something. Secondly, that they're really, I don't think, and it's always rather difficult to talk about things that didn't actually happen, whether they could have or could not have happened, but I don't think that there were the resources in Austria to accept this vast number of people. I don't think that Eisenhower would have accepted them for a minute, and I don't think, therefore, there was anywhere else they could go. And I fear, therefore, that Alexander's order on pragmatic grounds was more or less inevitable from an Allied point of view.
I know it's difficult to look back and say what might have happened, but if we did look back and assume that the Fifth Corps sent a telegram to Alexander asking, do you want us to also send back women and children? And knowing that Alexander and certainly Macmillan believed that it would be dangerous to their health if they would go back to Yugoslavia. Everyone kind of knew that.
Yes.
Do you think Alexander would have told Fifth Corps to send back women and children as well as soldiers?
Now you put that, I think it's a very good question, because I think frankly we don't know, and I think it's questionable whether he would have done. Everything else that Alexander did throughout this period shows that he was absolutely adamant that women and children should not be handed over. Indeed, he didn't, that nobody should be handed over by force. As you say, quote, he said to both to the combined chiefs of staff and to Eisenhower that to hand these people over to their enemies might be fatal to their health, and he knew perfectly well what that meant. Mm-hmm. And had Fifth Corps behaved in the way that I suspect any other corps in the British Army or the American Army would have behaved, which is to raise very vigorous questioning about all this and say, but can you possibly, which is what everybody else said, can you possibly contemplate handing over women and children to be slaughtered? Well, then I think it's fair to say that probably Alexander wouldn't have contemplated it. And he certainly would have asked anyway. He would have asked for instructions from the combined chiefs of staff. He wouldn't have just acted unilaterally, I don't think.
So certainly then General Keatley and Brigadier General Lowe would have been within their rights to at least question the order.
Certainly, because after all, Alexander was not, we're talking about a hypothetical thing, because in fact they never did surrender, but if we're talking about Alexander's information, he was very seriously misinformed. And if, on the contrary, he'd not only been correctly informed, but on top of that, had some, which they were perfectly entitled to make, some objection on moral grounds, I think, given the sort of man Alexander was, it's almost unthinkable that he would not have taken precautions to protect the women and children.
In fact, weren't there orders handed down to different divisions stating to the fact that if the Croatians should try to somehow force their way past British lines, that if there are women and children with these Croatian soldiers, that they should not be stopped by force, they should not be shot at.
Yes. I mean, of course...
So there was some concern for women and children.
Very considerable concern. And I think obviously, we're talking about this appalling war crime, as I see it, and tragedy. One can't exaggerate the humanity of British troops. On the whole, the evidence suggests very clearly that the majority of British troops of all ranks were strongly opposed to any use of violence against women and children, indeed of using violence against soldiers who'd surrendered to them. I mean, they did use very severe violence against the Cossacks, but only with considerable reluctance, and indeed with them, amongst many units, threatened mutiny, and the operations had to be halted because the objections were so widespread and strong. So I think, and as you say, there are those orders, which you can see in Nigel Nicholson's logbook, that they were to fire on Croatian troops crossing the Drava, but if they had women and children among them, they were not to fire. And I think if one, for a moment, having considered all the options open to the British or to the Anglo-American command, and looks at it from the Croatian point of view, I've always thought that really that General Herencic made a very grievous error, to say the least, in allowing himself to be browbeaten by Scott and Basta. He should never have surrendered to Basta. He should simply have ordered his troops on no account to fire against the British, maybe to retain their arms because if they would need them, but simply to continue peacefully marching. If they were fired upon, not to retaliate. And the British, I'm sure, would not. They wouldn't have perpetrated a massacre, even on the troops. They certainly, because one can see their orders, they would have shot some. But after all, we're talking about what everybody knew was going to be a tragedy of major proportions if they ever got into the hands of the partisans. Herencic knew that. Everybody knew it. Mm-hmm. Scott says he didn't know, but he must have had a pretty shrewd idea. And so they would have, whatever happened ultimately, which really it would be anybody's guess, it couldn't have been worse than what did happen with the death marches and the massacre in the fields beyond south of Bleiburg. And I think an awful lot would have escaped, and it would have been a very difficult decision for the British if Herencic had maintained perfect discipline and never allowed them to fire at the British, to send in sort of tanks, planes, and everything else, and bomb and shell into submission such a colossal mass of people inside the Allied zone. I can't really envisage it happening in those terms. I don't know quite what would have happened.
So after the Croatians were handed over to the Yugoslavs on Alexander's orders on the 15th and 16th, then on the 17th, didn't Alexander rescind the orders? And
he rescinded it the
that
moment he knew that the crisis alarm over this unmanageable number, as I would describe it, or I'm sure he would, the moment that alarm was over and he was alerted to the fact that this was a false alarm, at once he issued his order of the 17th of May, which said that people infiltrating into British zone should be treated as dissident Yugoslavs, isn't it? I think in any way, words to the effect that they shall be interned and not handed over.
Mm-hmm. Which really brings us now to a whole another period of a period of deception on the part of the British Army against several ethnic groups in the area: Cossacks, Serbs, Slovenes, White Russians, and Croatians. Yes. They were deceived. You can tell the story better than I can, but the general idea is that they were deceived into believing they were going to Italy to possibly be trained for anti-communist forces. They would receive food there. They would receive clothing, and when in fact they were herded into cattle cars, sometimes as many as 80 and 90 in a cattle car. At which point, when the doors were closed, a lock was put on the outside of the door, and they were transported into Yugoslavia by the British Army. That seems to be a whole nother period, which is very important, and it's really for me as an American, and I'm sure for you as a person born in England, it's difficult to believe that the British could act in such a way. And some people have even compared that action with putting Jews into cattle cars and sending them to Auschwitz, believing that they were going to work camps.
Well, there's no question, I think, that it was a major war crime, the only one, as far as I know, committed by a Western power during the war, any major war crime. And had it been committed by enemy troops, and had they been brought, the officers concerned, been brought to trial after the war, they would certainly have been condemned and suffered very severe punishment, probably a death sentence in some cases, because it was absolutely comparable to the Nazis sending Jews off to camps, and indeed in some degrees it was worse, because the British officers responsible didn't suffer or weren't threatened by the penalties which a German officer would suffer if he declined to obey such an order. We know that, because when British officers or soldiers did refuse to obey, in no case that I know of was any of them punished. Not long after this, the British military, the commander in Allied military government in Styria, refused to hand over any Soviet citizen from his zone, despite a flat order to do so, against their will. And he was simply told, it was a very brave action, because he didn't know what would happen, but in the actual fact, that he was simply recalled to England, and as he told me with great pride himself, Colonel Wilkinson, on his report, it said, lacks initiative. He was very proud of that. Mm-hmm. But that was the worst that could happen. So it was less excusable. Now, I think the other thing which one has to remember, as you say, it is a completely new phase. And it's also a phase that, for the most part, takes place after the crisis with Tito is over, or any real fear of unarmed clash. Mm-hmm. During those early days, from the first British arrival to the 19th, when Brigadier Lowe made an agreement with the communist partisan commissar. Well, first of all, he made an agreement on the 15th with Hocevar, and then on the, I think it was on the 17th or 19th with Ivanovic, successively, in which it was agreed to hand over, first of all Croatians, didn't say troops, all Croatians. And secondly, finally, all Yugoslavs, whoever they were, whatever their ethnic or national origin. And this was started, and the actual handovers didn't begin, I think I'm right in saying, till, 23rd or 24th, when the crisis was, to all intents and purposes, over. And there was no quid pro quo, no pressure that Tito could arrive, no discernible motive that I know of for doing this. It couldn't even be claimed, as is rather pathetically attempted in the case of the Cossacks, that they were British prisoners of war whom Tito might have hung on to, whom he'd liberated. There was nothing that Tito could offer, and
there was not even a Yalta agreement.
There was no Yalta agreement, so there was no misunderstanding that could have happened.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea who was responsible for the actual design, whereby these various ethnic groups were told that they were going to Italy and then turned into Yugoslavia? I know that orders were handed down that the Croatians in particular were not to know where their destination was. But who actually designed and fabricated the story that they were going to Italy rather than Yugoslavia?
Well, first of all, I should slightly modify something you said earlier. I think that whilst it's quite true that many people, Croatians, Serbs and Slovenes, or especially Croatians and Serbian Chetniks, thought that they were going to places where they might be trained to fight against Tito. Mm-hmm. In practice, I'm sure that no British soldiers would have told them that, because this would have been flatly contradictory to policy and orders. They might quite understandably believe it, but it's quite true, of course, that they were told they were being taken to safety. I think in virtually every case they were told they were going to Italy. Right. And they believed this, and they believed it for an understandable reason, because, as I mentioned earlier, General Damjanovic and his 11,000 or 12,000 Chetniks had already surrendered on the 4th of May. Their surrender had been accepted. They were held in camps at Palmanova, and there was no intention of handing them over, and they never were handed over. And this was known particularly to the Serbian Chetniks, and so it was understandable they should be deceived. Now, who gave the instruction for this, which was which I think virtually every British soldier involved looks upon as totally dishonourable and a slur on the reputation of the people responsible, which it was. It's quite clear that the order came from Brigadier Lowe himself. He denies it. He can't deny the fact that in the order actually signed by him, it says they would not be told of their destination. But to go beyond that and to say that it seems to me, anyway, absolutely clear that it was Brigadier Lowe who conceived of it. Maybe Keatley, of course, did as well, that we don't know. The evidence, to me, is very clear. First of all, it's too ludicrous for words to suppose that he believed that it was practical for British officers in the field in a whole number of different camps would say to the camp leaders or commanders, you are now to get into these trucks, and if asked was to say, I can't tell you where you're going, and that they would not ask further. And if they did ask further and were not told anything, that they would not be suspicious and that there would not be all sorts of awkwardnesses. Mm-hmm. Secondly, he must have considered, or he wasn't doing his duty, what would happen if awkwardnesses arose in consequence. He would have to consider whether force was to be used, because this is naturally what the troops in the field would have to know. Now, we know that, in fact, from what happened in Victory Camp, that force was used when the people discovered what was happening and refused to go back. And quite clearly, therefore, orders must have been given. I shall know more about this on Monday when I've tracked down and will be interviewing the British commandant at Victory, whom hitherto I've never been able to speak to. No. But I'd be very surprised if he doesn't confirm that his orders were to use force if necessary. And I shall also know from him, so I'll be better informed than I am now, for certain, whether he himself improvised this lie or whether he was ordered to convey it. Well, I'm virtually certain in anticipation he could not possibly have thought it up himself and was definitely ordered to convey it to them.
You mentioned in your book, Minister in the Massacres, Captain Nigel Nicholson, who was an intelligence officer for the 6th Armored Division.
1st Armored Brigade, yes.
1st Armored Brigade. In his situation reports, which he sent...
1st Guards Brigade, sorry.
1st Guards Brigade. In his situation reports, which I believe he sent up every day through the chain of hierarchy and also down to the brigades below him, he mentions the fact that these Croatians are being repatriated, that they're being told that they're going to Italy rather than Yugoslavia, and he mentions that it's also most unsavory on the part of for every British soldier involved in it. It seems a most unpleasant and unsavory act. Later, you write that he was brought into his superior's office, and he was told, I believe, that reports of this kind were not to be made again. Do you recall whether any reports following that had been changed or modified to show otherwise, to show that possibly there was smooth operations?
For the most part, the orders, the war diaries and the reports simply don't mention incidents. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I have a great deal of evidence from eyewitnesses, both British and Croatian or Serbian or Slovene, that very terrible incidents indeed took place. For instance, since my book was published, I have an account from a former British officer now living in South Africa of, I think it's some 50 Croatian officers who, when they were taken to Bleiburg to be handed over, this would have been, I think, about the 23rd or 4th of May, that when they discovered they were in the presence of the Partisans, which they had no idea that they were going to be, they pulled out their revolvers because the officers were still allowed their sidearms, and a whole series of them began committing suicide. And I mention this because it's not in my book. I will publish it eventually. And there were some armoured cars nearby, and the British officer was completely taken aback. He'd never been led to believe that anything like this would happen. He became quite hysterical, and he shouted to this chap who was in charge of a squadron of armoured cars supervising the handover, and he said, "Stop them, stop them." Well, as the man, the young subaltern, wrote to me and said, "Well, this is ridiculous. How do you stop people from committing with an armoured car?" Mm-hmm. You couldn't. But what's interesting is that this episode, which must have caused alarm bells to ring right back up the chain of command, and I now then, on checking, found an order which said all Croatian officers will now be deprived of their sidearms. It doesn't say why, but we know why from that. But there's no report of this. You would not know it existed if you read the war diaries. So there was very clear concealment of what was going on at the handover points.
High levels of the British Army knew all along, didn't they, that once the Croatians and Cossacks and Croatians and Slovenes and Serbs were taken across the border and handed over to Yugoslavs, that they were being murdered, and that the only reason they knew that is because several people escaped from the murders, fled back to the British zone under the 8th Army, and reported the fact that people were being butchered on the other side of the border, and still the repatriations continued. They never did stop, although they did have these eyewitness accounts at the time.
Well, I would restrict that a little. I don't think, and I'll explain why I think that, that the higher command, if by that you mean anyone higher than 5th Corps, knew anything about it at the time. And indeed, when they did know about it, they intervened very swiftly to stop it. But if one looks at the 5th Corps, yes, whatever they might pretend they knew or didn't know when they made the decisions, they were very swiftly enlightened. And indeed, they did know, because after all, British troops in the field knew what they saw and nothing else, and knew awfully little about what was actually going on in Yugoslavia. They had no reason to know about it. Whereas higher up the line, they certainly did know, because after all these incidents, if they weren't reported across geographically, no reason why a unit in a neighbouring valley should know what would happen across the mountains, but they were certainly reported to the staff at 5 Corps headquarters in Klagenfurt. Certainly Brigadier Lowe knew everything that was going on, and it was his job to do so.
Well, if we could go back just for a moment, back to May 17th, wasn't it Toby Lowe who gave the order that all Yugoslav nationals, he used that term, I think, all Yugoslav nationals should be sent back to Yugoslavia? Now, isn't it here we kind of take a quantum leap from anti-Yugoslav forces, as they were termed at the time, to all Yugoslav nationals, which, of course, includes women and children?
Exactly. And also ones who were not, I mean, it included Serbian Chetniks who were still in the uniform of King Peter, who had never cooperated with the Germans, and which he knew perfectly well they never had, and it was very well known to the troops looking after them that they never had.
How do you account for this jump now from...
Well, it is a gigantic jump. You've got the order of the 14th May, which is restricted entirely to Yugoslavs serving in the German forces, to use its phraseology. That order was never actually used, because as we pointed out, discussed earlier, on the 17th of May, the moment Alexander was relieved of the fear that the great mass of Croatians had surrendered, and that was no longer a consideration, he quickly issued a new order saying that no people will be handed over, and they will be interned and kept as dissident Yugoslavs. That order, we know, was, though if you looked in the Public Record Office you wouldn't know it, because so many orders have been destroyed, but because of copies I've got, mainly in the American National Archives, we now know that that order, though it only was directed to 8th Army, was definitely made known by 8th Army, probably on the following day, the 18th, to 5 Corps. So they knew of this new policy of Alexander's, that nobody from Yugoslavia should be handed back. Nevertheless, and despite this, as you say, on the 19th, Lowe made this agreement, which is there for anyone to read, with the Yugoslav Communist Commissar Ivanovic, that all Yugoslavs, regardless of age, sex, ethnic origin, soldier or civilian, should be handed over. In other words, he had no authority for this whatever, and was very well aware that it was Allied Force headquarters that none should be handed over anyway. And that indeed that provisions were being made for all of them to be transported down into Italy. So they weren't even going to be his responsibility.
When did the repatriations finally stop?
They stopped at the end of the month, on the 31st of May, when there was it was brought home to the commanders of the camps, principally at Viktring, south of Austria, where there were some Croatians, but mainly Serbs and Slovenes, that, as you mentioned earlier, that people began to dribble back who'd escaped. And it wasn't long before their accounts, which were so vivid, persuaded the more junior British commanders in the field, officers, that this was true and that something dreadful was going on, and this was reported up the line. Well, there was no question of General Keighley stopping the policy. He was obviously going to go through with it whatever happened. But General McCreary, about this time, was alerted to what was happening, mainly by the British Red Cross, which threatened to go on strike and to discontinue all operations in Austria if this policy continued. And McCreary, because we have the account of the chief Red Cross official in Austria who went to visit McCreary at his headquarters, and McCreary and the British Red Cross officer, Sir John Selby Biggs, says that it took him 3/4 of an hour to persuade McCreary of what was happening. Now, I think that is very strong evidence of just how much in the dark McCreary was. He simply didn't believe it. But when he did come to believe it, he at once issued orders to stop it, and it did stop that moment. And from that moment onward, none was handed over. Within a couple of days, Alexander was notified by McCreary of what was going on, and simultaneously, objections were coming in about the Cossacks. Alexander was absolutely furious. He at once flew on the 4th of June, as soon as he could, straight to Klagenfurt. He went personally to the camp at Viktring, where people had been handed over, and had a notice put up in the camp, which we still have, which says that no people will be handed over against their will. The following day, he went to a Cossack camp at Spital and intervened to halt all use of force there. So really the evidence that both McCreary and Alexander were throughout opposed to and never authorized either the use of force or the use of lies to hand people over is crystal clear, I think.
Nicholson, looking back, I'm sorry, Mr. Tolstoy, looking back over this whole period, say for example from the time the British Army entered Carinthia to possibly May 21st, when the Yugoslav Army actually pulled out of Carinthia. There was a period there where, if you wanted to be gracious to the Fifth Corps leaders and to Alexander, you could say that from their point of view, there was a crisis at the time, that Tito was in both Trieste and Carinthia, that there were hundreds of thousands of people that were all pretty much hostile towards each other, that there was a problem with feeding them, with controlling them. You could say that all that occurred between May 8th and May 21st, when Tito finally pulled out of Carinthia. But there was a period between May 21st and May 31st when none of that existed, when the numbers of the anti-Yugoslav forces, including Croatians, were so small in Carinthia that there was no longer a crisis with Tito in Carinthia because Tito had pulled out. When Alexander had given orders on May 17th that all repatriations were to stop, including those repatriations occurring in the Fifth Corps, when the American government had come out and ordered that repatriation should stop. That was their official policy, along with the Foreign Office. It seems to me that all along, through that period of May 21st and May 31st, there was absolutely no reason, no legitimate reason why the Fifth Corps should have continued on with the repatriations. And in effect, weren't they actually violating every order down from at least not the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but from the Foreign Office, from the American State Department, from Alexander, Field Marshal Alexander? Wasn't all the repatriations in that period of time not only against orders, but there was no reason because Tito had now pulled out of Carinthia?
Exactly. I mean, first of all, I think you can state as a categorical fact that no action performed by Fifth Corps in repatriating people who'd escaped from Yugoslavia, though every single action either violated or exceeded or superior orders coming down. Secondly, you can say that there was, throughout this period, a quite extraordinary determination of Fifth Corps to hand over every single person who escaped from Yugoslavia, regardless of the suffering, regardless of the treachery, regardless of the effect on morale of British troops, that nothing coming from above would suggest any necessity for this whatever, nor was there any real reason that we know of, official or pragmatic reason of administration or whatever, which would impel them to do this. No satisfactory explanation being given by the two people surviving responsible for the decision, Macmillan and Aldington. Now, as you say, there's in addition to this, you've got an initial period of chaos, confusion, when spuriously, I would say, you could claim that this affected the decisions being made. But again, as you point out, after the 19th of May, when the agreement was made by Tito, or at least by his representative Ivanovic, with Lowe, to pull out, an agreement which had absolutely nothing to do, and Aldington himself confirms this, had nothing to do with the handover of the prisoners, and everything to do with the imminent threat of war with the Anglo-Americans, in which the Soviets had informed Tito that they would not back him in the event of such a war. He made the agreement, as you say, by the 21st, or 22nd or 23rd at latest. The last Yugoslav partisan was out of Carinthia. And yet virtually all the handovers took place after that date, between, I think it's the 24th and the 31st, when there was no motive for whatever for doing it, and every reason for being able to halt it, because not only was it clear from every order, particularly that of the 17th, that higher command was not anxious, to say the least, to hand over these people against their will, but on top of that, it could have been drawn to their attention, instead of being concealed as it was, that they included large numbers of women and children, that the only way of getting them to return was by the use of force or lies, and that already a considerable body of evidence existed to show that people were being slaughtered on being handed over. All these things were concealed and withheld. So you do have, what one can only say, the most extraordinary and irrational determination of the Fifth Corps to oblige Tito in this respect. And when you take that in conjunction with the even stranger, if anything, determination to oblige the Soviets in the matter of handing over the non-Soviet citizens among the Cossacks, in particular the very distinguished Tsarist generals, you have something which is inexplicable on its own terms, which is difficult and dangerous to implement, for which the alternative, that is, of obeying the orders coming down from above, sending all these people to safety in Italy, and where they were no longer the responsibility of Fifth Corps, was the easiest thing in the world. And in fact, I think the most extreme example of that is of the Cossacks held at Lienz, about 25,000 of them. It was proposed on about the 19th of May that the Americans at Schaeff should take over the Lienz area, and in that, at one blow, the whole Cossack problem, as far as it affected those Cossacks, would have been removed without moving a single Cossack from Five Corps responsibility. And it actually, in the war diaries, it says the Fifth Corps fought this tooth and nail successfully to keep the Cossack problem. So when now we're told they wish to get rid of this problem, on the contrary, they wanted the problem and they wanted to solve it in one way, and one way only. Now, I think it's the job of any self-respecting historian to explain what was the motivation behind this, and that's what I've tried to do, and what, of course, by certain interested parties, I've been bitterly criticized or even censored for attempting to do. It's said that it's a bad form, old boy, to look into these things too deeply. Well, I think if I were to sum up, it is absolutely clear on the evidence, direct evidence, not just circumstantial evidence, that Macmillan, on the 13th of May, intervened and in some way persuaded Keighley, which probably wasn't very difficult to do, because we know that Keighley was rather a stupid general, and we know, of course, that Macmillan had immense prestige, his position as minister and confidant of Churchill, so that's not difficult to imagine. He persuaded Keighley that for some overriding political reason it was necessary to do this in despite of all existing orders, and to persuade Keighley to do, which is really an unthinkable thing for a soldier to do, and that is to deceive his superiors whilst he was doing it. Nevertheless, Keighley did all these things, remained silent to his dying day. Macmillan remained either silent or openly lying about it, and the same is true about Aldington, who has written to me in 1974 saying he never had played any part whatever in the handover of Cossacks, and in 1978 said he had nothing to do with the handover of Yugoslavs. He signed the orders, not like Waldheim, where people say he might or might not have initialed something which might or might not have related to something else. Aldington ordered these things to happen. So they've lied, they've deceived, they lied then, they deceived then, they've lied since and deceived since. And I think, and I personally, there are many other things to do, I shall not rest until I have done whatever I can do in my lifetime to uncover what that overriding motivation was.
Just one more question before we stop. Was it General Keighley who, several weeks after the repatriation stopped, told Lady Limerick that, in fact, there were no repatriations, that the Yugoslavs, in his terms Yugoslavs, which included Croatians, Serbs, Slovenes, had went back to Yugoslavia of their own volition, and they volunteered actually to go back to Yugoslavia, and there were no forced repatriations. Didn't he? Wasn't he?
Yeah,
the one
that's right. He lied to her. Lady Limerick was, what was she, deputy chairman of the Red Cross, and as I explained earlier, that the Red Cross had actually threatened to go on strike, which would of course have caused such embarrassment that in fact it did. It ended the forced repatriation and was acutely embarrassing, and General Keighley actually had to go and see Lady Limerick and lie to her in order to make sure. Now, it's a rather mysterious report, that, just in passing, because it's dated July, but all the context suggests that it must have been happening, to my mind, in the beginning of June, when this crisis blew up, and there was no particular reason for him to see Lady Limerick once the crisis was over. And Lady Limerick herself, when she was alive, wrote to me and said that she did not go to Austria at that time, and she had her diary, so she knew. And so I may be wrong, I couldn't prove it, but I think this was a lie at the time designed to try and cover up operations still in effect rather than subsequently. Yes.
So it's your contention that through your research and through your writing, through your interviews, that the lies began several weeks after the repatriation stopped, and they continue on today in the form of Lord Aldington?
Yes, they do. And it'll be interesting to see. It's not the most satisfactory way in which to conduct these things, but at the forthcoming trial, assuming Lord Aldington goes through with it, I certainly will, whatever happens and whatever the risk, how Lord Aldington answers these questions, because for the first time he won't be able to raise red herrings and so forth. He will be asked these very specific questions. You received this order, why did you then issue this order, which goes far beyond or flagrantly violates it? He will have to answer under cross-examination of a clever lawyer. And I just cannot imagine what he will say. I think he'll be in a very difficult position. We will then also be able to subpoena witnesses, which is something historians can't do and journalists can't do. And we can compel people who've hitherto remained silent to speak. And in that context, I'm particularly thinking of someone whose name we haven't raised, but I think should do, and that's Sir Charles Villiers, a distinguished, if that's the right word, British public figure, chairman of British Steel and so forth, who at the time was working with Special Operations Executive. He had been in Yugoslavia. He was a personal friend of Tito's. He happened to be Lord Aldington's oldest and best friend, as Aldington himself told me. And
Can you briefly explain that? Because I did neglect to mention this. The 6th Special Operation Forces?
The 6th Special Staff Force, it was called, had been operating in Yugoslavia with the communist partisans. When the war ended, it was ordered up into Austria to assist 5th Corps in conducting relations with Tito, or at least with Tito's forces. And it was stationed right on the border at the mouth of the Rosenbach Tunnel, which runs under the Karavanke Mountains, and which is where half the handovers took place. And they played, as we know from Nigel Nicholson's logbook, and from the account of the Chetnik refugee, Todorovic was it, I think, whose account is preserved in the Public Record Office, that they played a very sinister role indeed. They not only were present at the handovers, but they were actually on the other side of the frontier, dealing directly with the partisan leaders, and were even present, or credibly reported as present, at some of the massacres. So they knew and even participated in the slaughter. And their commander was then Major Charles Villiers. Now, what was their role? Why were they there at all? It seems to me that the motive for having them was to, the last stage of the operation had become so distasteful to the regular British troops, which happened 3rd Welsh Guards in that case, for example, that they were actually raising very vigorous objection. And as a result, these murders had to be concealed as far as possible, and that was the job of 6th Special Force. Now, Major Villiers isn't mentioned in the logbook, which seems to suggest that he was not actually on the spot at that moment. Otherwise, I think he would have been. There are continual references to a Lieutenant Lockheed, whom I have in vain have advertised even in the British papers, but I haven't been able to trace him, no doubt for good reason. And one must ask oneself, where was Major Villiers? Well, as Aldington himself told me, Villiers was his oldest friend, and they had shared digs together at Oxford, and Villiers was his best man, and so on, at his wedding. My guess is that Villiers, what would he have been doing at that time if he wasn't with this tiny unit of 20 men? Where was he? He wasn't at 5th Corps headquarters. I think he was over the frontier at Ljubljana with Tito, who we know had secretly moved up north at this time, almost certainly to supervise the massacres, and that I suspect that Villars was the liaison man whom the British certainly needed with Tito. Now, I can't prove that, but on the other hand, what I can prove, and I showed in my book, is that Major Villars has, or Sir Charles as he now is, has lied himself blue in the face as to his role. He, unlike Macmillan and Aldington, was not nearly so careful. When he was approached by a Serbian refugee who asked him if 6th Special Force had played any part in the handover of royalist Chetniks, he wrote about 7 categorical denials that he even knew that such things were taking place, or that 6th Special Force had had anything to do with it, or that they would have had anything to do with it, and so forth. Now we know, which was only subsequently discovered and which Villars never could have anticipated from Nigel Nicholson's logbook, that in fact they were up to their necks in it, and Villars must have known. So we know he's a liar, and that he has some reason, good reason, for concealing his role. Now we, in this court case, can for the first time, he refused to see me, incidentally, we can now summon him and have him cross-examined, which I fear is one reason why it'll be interesting if by the time this film is shown, will confirm or not what I now wonder, and that is whether Aldington will ever dare appear in court. And I'm afraid my guess is, given all the points that we've discussed here this afternoon, that it simply is an unanswerable case.